Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock-flavoured podcast. Over the last couple of years, we've touched on Moorcock's influence on the science fiction and fantasy genres, not only as an author, but as an editor and nurturer of new talent thanks to his work on a variety of publications, but most recognisably via New Worlds. New Worlds magazine had been around since the 1930s, but once Moorcock got a hold of it in the 60s, he, as one of the foremost British authors in the so-called New Wave of more socially progressive and experimental science fiction, he reformatted it as a folio or digest-sized publication and took it to new places. He contributed many works himself under his own name and under pseudonyms like James Colvin, including the original novella version of Behold the Man. New Worlds would also publish a range of British authors, including a young Terry Pratchett, M. John Harrison and Robert Holdstock, and continuing their presence in the magazine were the likes of John Brunner, J.G. Ballard and Brian Aldiss. Aldiss rejected the notion of his status as part of the New Wave, though, insisting he'd been around before it and he'd be around after it was gone. Moorcock also attracted a host of American authors as contributors to New Worlds, such as Roger Zelazny, Thomas N. Dish and Harlan Ellison. Ellison, as it happened, was busy editing and promoting his own New Wave SF story collection in the USA. 1967's Dangerous Visions, and, later in the early 70s, again Dangerous Visions, collected dozens of genre-challenging and boundary-pushing short stories by a host of authors, many now considered giants in their field, such as Philip K. Dick, Norman Spinrad, Larry Niven, Poul Anderson, Fritz Leiber and Samuel R. Delany, to name but a few. So much talent, so much content. Incredibly gratifying, then, that this show's guest, Andrew Nette, journalist, writer and lover of all things pulp, along with his co-editor Ian McIntyre, has compiled a series of over 30 fantastic essays looking at the impact of radical science fiction from the 1950s to the 1980s. Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, Radical Science Fiction 1950 to 1985, is hitting bookshelves now in the USA and in the coming weeks elsewhere, and is a follow-up to their similarly fabulous volumes published by PM Press, Girl Gangs, Biker Boys and Real Cool Cats, and, sticking it to the man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction 1950 to 1980. So Andrew and I hooked up over the Derry and Toms telephonometron to discuss all of this, the delights of pulp nastiness, the Australian view of genre fiction and pulp, and some other bits and bobs. So sit back, sharpen a bamboo cane, and join us as we talk New Worlds and Dangerous Visions. And we're back in Derry and Toms, and on this occasion I've got with me Andrew Nette, co-editor and author of some of the contents of Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, which I think is your third publication for PM Press, looking at the wide variety of genre fiction and science fiction and various other things that we'll drill our way down into. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for coming along.
Thank you very much for having me, Andy.
It's an absolute pleasure. So, just by way of introduction, normally we would talk about a Moorcock book specifically, but just to kick us off, tell us just a little bit about the book, Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, and how it originated, and then we can drill down a little bit into some of the inspirations behind it.
Well, the book is the third book that I've co-edited for a publisher in the US called PM Press. And, I mean, they've all basically looked at various aspects of pulp and popular publishing in the post-war period, the 50s, 60s, 70s, going into the 80s, but mainly the 50s, 60s, 70s. The first book we did was called Girl Gangs, Biker Boys, Real Cool Cats, Pulp Fiction and Youth Culture 1950 to 1980, and that's when we looked at sort of the wide expanse of how pulp fiction had, I suppose, depicted youth culture, youth subculture in the post-war period, and that was everything. We started out with, and they were basically based in looking at books from the US, the UK and Australia. That first one started out with juvenile delinquents, or they had various names in the US. In the UK, they were teddy boys. In Australia, they were known as bodgies and widgies. And then we moved through beatniks, and then hippies, and then we did groupies. We had an extensive section on bikies, and then moved into the 1970s. That one was very heavy into New English Library.
Yeah.
And looking at their depiction of, I suppose, various English subcultures, but also their whole look at bikie fiction, which was a huge strand of 1960s, 1970s pulp fiction in the UK, the US and Australia. Then we did a second book, which is called Sticking It to the Man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction. And that was sort of looking at how, I suppose, various radical movements had been depicted in pulp and popular fiction. Again, in Australia, the UK and the US. That was a huge book. And when we delivered it to the publisher, they basically said, look, this is far too big. We can't handle a book this size. And the book included, so it looked at all these various radical movements, but it also included science fiction. And I sort of said to the publisher, well, look, why don't we just hive out all the science fiction and we'll do a third book? And that third book ended up being, which was just a third book purely about science fiction, which is the one we're primarily talking about today, Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. And that actually could have been, I feel like that could have been 4 or 5 times the size it is. And we still wouldn't have been able to cover everything we wanted to cover in it.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the first book. I'm old enough to remember the tail end of the Teddy Boy craze. And did Shawaddy Waddy ever break over in Australia?
Oh, but yes, I do vaguely remember them. Yes, yeah. They were.
Well, when I was a kid, I remember Shawaddy Waddy being on top of the pops, but the main reason I remember Teddy Boys is because I used to catch buses from Hull Bus Station, and Hull Bus Station in those days was like this old cast iron riveted iron frame with a crappy old roof that was probably made out of asbestos or something, with old concrete platforms. But there was a bus driver's cafeteria just to the side of it, where all the bus drivers would hang out, smoke fags, drink mugs of tea, and everything else. And there were two who, when I was a kid, probably were may well have been in the 50s or even early 60s, who still dressed. They had their bus driver's coat on, but everything else, they were full Teddy Boy. They had the Teddy Boy hair, the huge, I forget what they called the shoes, the huge platform shoes. I have really, really fond memories of kind of just how different, kind of culturally, those like little touch points that you still had when I was a kid of what came before in terms of, that cultural zeitgeist around certain things. And this is why I find genre fiction so interesting and so exciting, is because it's a link back into those things. But anyway, we'll get into all that rubbish anyway.
Well, it's also a link into these movements that were once huge, such a huge part of the cultural imagination and the cultural economy of countries, that are now almost disappeared. I mean, one of the things, jumping around a bit, but one of the things is that there's a subculture in Australia. I don't know, you wouldn't have heard it in the UK. They were called sharps. And sharps were, and that's the other thing about, when you talk about these subcultures, they sort of blend into each other and borrow from each other. And the delineations around them, are very sort of, are very malleable and flexible, aren't they? But sharps they were kind of like skinhead. They were sort of skins, but they were moving into punks. And they used to have these gangs in Melbourne of sharps in the 70s. There used to be like the Thomastown Sharps and the Broady Sharps, and they were these. They had really short hair, and they used to wear the big boots and the really tight jeans, and they used to have Sharpie girls. And these were a major moral panic, I remember, in the 70s in Melbourne when I was growing up. And they were largely a Melbourne phenomenon, I think. There would be certain train lines that you were told, don't go on that train line because that's this sharp gang's, territory. Yeah. And they would be in all the papers. But actually, in terms of history and in terms of their depiction and fiction, I have not been able to find, and I've looked, a single book, literary, popular, pulp or otherwise, in terms of fiction, that is a depiction of sharps. They have been completely eradicated from the public consciousness in Australia, in Melbourne, despite the fact, I know a couple of people. I know a guy who runs a second-hand bookstore in Northcote. We're going to be throwing around lots of names here of places in Melbourne and the UK that various people, depending on where you're from, may not know. Runs a second-hand bookshop. He did a history of the sharps. And I know there's bits and pieces of other stuff, but literally they've totally disappeared. And you find that with these subcultures. Yeah. And because they're marginal and they're not elite subcultures, they're often quite working class, or they're seen as quite subversive. They just don't get catalogued. They don't get the like everyone can talk about where they were at Woodstock, because of these people have all gone on to run tech companies and work in the film business and things like that. no one ever tells you, no one can ever say, remember famous events in Sharpie history.
Yeah.
Or probably for Teddy boys as well,
Yeah.
I find that kind of stuff quite fascinating, that things that were such a major part of our culture have totally been obliterated.
That's one of the shames of it, isn't it? Because I remember finding this growing up when I talked to my parents about things, or my aunts and uncles, because you grow up thinking that our cultural history is basically dominated by those people you just mentioned, the people who might have been at Woodstock, or the people who were hippies at the time and who went on to found companies and become Richard Branson or whatever. And when you grow up, you kind of have this idea that that's what it was like. But then I talk to my folks, and it's like the closest they got to any kind of hippie movement in Hull was when, I don't know, Pink Floyd played the ABC nightclub in 1967 or 68 or something like that. And the closest they came to really kind of counterculture in like the working class environments of Hull where they were growing up was, because they heard that someone from the Spiders from Mars was from East Hull,
Yeah, right, yeah. Of course.
So it's, and you're right, it's a shame. And there's a book absolutely crying out to be written there about these people, about this subculture, and I don't know. I guess it's just such a shame that you're 40 years past that point. At some point, when all of a sudden it occurs to you that little piece of cultural history is kind of vanishing,
and you've almost left it too late. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these people are. I mean, the 50s is a memory now. The 60s very soon will be a memory. The 70s is on its way. I've got a couple of projects going on the board about to touch on aspects of these. But these are times that are rapidly fading from the living memory. And once they fade from the living memory, and the people who do have a living memory, let's be honest, are very old. Their memory is not as sharp as it would have been.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to think that somewhere that those Teddy Boy bus drivers are probably long dead now, and that little piece of cultural memory of Hull, which must have had a Teddy Boy scene, because there were these bus drivers in the 1980s still clinging on to it. Yeah, it is a shame, and it needs to be captured. And I'll just kind of give a little shout out to a series of books by a publisher in the UK who've been publishing. They're only about 24 pages, but they're basically just photographs of Hull. Black and white photographs of Hull. I always kind of love the idea of being able to just keep hold of a grip of some of these things, because when I was a kid in Hull, I remember large parts of it still being wasteland from the bombings in World War II, and obviously that's not something you want to hold on to, but it's actually a serious part of our culture and heritage that is just really concreted over now. And it's really great when you get these little, basically what are effectively zines, which just kind of show you some of these things. And usually there's always something nicely artistic about seeing a photograph of an old street of terraced back-to-back houses with a kid playing with a milk bottle.
Oh, sure. Well, there is change, and change happens, and change is not always bad. That's certainly it. But I think also we have a very skewed view of what history, what architecture, what culture is worth preserving. I mean, the example from Melbourne, which anyone from Melbourne will be able to relate to, is the Docklands. The Docklands was this massive area on the outskirts of Melbourne, on the bay, that was a Docklands. It was for a long time it was an active Docklands, and then it was just sort of old docks and old buildings. And in the 90s and early 2000s, virtually the entire lot was knocked down, and this incredibly hideous antiseptic suburb, this made suburb, was created there called Docklands. But see, there was never any sense that, and I'm not saying that we should keep the entire Docklands, but there was never any sense that any of it was worth chronicling or worth keeping or worth preserving, So
Hull and Melbourne sound very similar in that respect, because the vast majority of the docks in Hull have been filled in with cement, and sterile housing estates have been placed on them. Fairly middle class. Some grass verges, some trees, and everything else. But yeah, almost the entirety of Hull's historic docklands long gone. You've got a North Sea ferries terminal and a couple of docks just south of the city centre. Pretty much everything else is gone. And it is a shame, but that's progress, isn't it? Anyway, we always go off on tangents on this podcast, and
I'm with me.
we've kicked off with tangents, but so you're growing up in 70s Melbourne. Where did your first kind of entry point into this kind of genre fiction, things like Moorcock and skinhead novels and all these things? What was you in?
Well, I would like to have said that I was into some of this stuff earlier than I was, because for no other reason than the fact that I would have kept some of it so I wouldn't have to shell out the enormous amounts of money that you'd have to pay these days to buy any Richard Allen novel. Yeah. No, look, I mean, Melbourne, Australia, it was all, you know, you can look at the history of the clash between British and American culture in Australia. That's been an ongoing debate, basically going back to the 20s. We had aspects of both of those cultures and those cultural influences. But when I was growing up, when I was very young in the 70s, you know, my cultural entry points were, they would have been secondhand Valiant and you know, those British comics, Warlord and Valiant, all that stuff. I used to devour that stuff. And then when we got a bit older and we wised up to Action and 2000 AD and Battle and that sort of stuff, that was huge. So that probably, and along with things like Doctor Who and things like that, they were sort of the cultural entry points into that wider world of science fiction and pulp culture, I suppose. Like probably a lot of young people, I got into science fiction relatively early. I got into, talking about those sort of contradictory cultural influences, you know, it would have been, on the one hand, I was a huge Conan fan, so I'd read all the Robert E. Howard and all the various pastiches and completed books based on fragments of Robert E. Howard books. So I was big into Conan and sword and sorcery, but I was also very big into sort of starting to get into British science fiction, and certainly whatever I could get access to easily, which was in the 70s, mainly still Sphere and New English Library books. They just seemed to be much more easily available. I remember they were in newsagents. I'd just be able to go down to a newsagent and buy a Robert Heinlein New English Library edition or a Moorcock book. I also remember the Westerns. I remember those horrendous plantation pulps that were all influenced by Drum and Mandingo. They were everywhere. You know, those sort of, they'd been called slaver pulps or they'd been called plantation pulps. I remember that stuff very vividly. I also remember, we might have had some communication online about the fact that I really related to your Sven Hassel episode, but purely because Sven Hassel books, and I haven't yet to read a single Sven Hassel book, but they were everywhere. They were just all over the place. So those were the in points, but also thinking back about it too, TV, film, you know, we were pre-streaming culture. So I don't know about you, but in my house, Sunday night movie was a big deal at my house. And my parents would all sit up and watch the Sunday night movie, and I'd just sit up with them and watch whatever it was, Westerns, war films, spy films, occasionally science fiction, although that wasn't so big. And, of course, late night TV. So those things were really my sort of entry points into this. And, I mean, in terms of the sort of, I suppose, the broader themes of this podcast, you know, Moorcock was a big part of that. There was a Jerry Cornelius and the Elric books were a big part of that.
Yeah, and actually, Moorcock is obviously shot through Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, and we'll take a look at some of that as well. So a couple of the conversations we've had were really interesting in that you pointed out some of the things that were very, very specific, kind of Australian genre pulp stuff. And like really, I think we were having a conversation on Twitter about Sven Hassel, and there was lots of like Korean War pulp war novels. That over here it would have been all Douglas Reman Royal Navy ships on covers, or I don't think I ever read any Douglas Reman, but I remember reading HMS Ulysses by Alistair MacLean. But whereas I remember you sending some pictures of, I'm sure there were covers of pulp war novels with jet fighters fighting the Chinese MiG menace over South Korea.
Yeah, one of the biggest pulp publishers I did my PhD and it's going to come out as a book next year. With an English publisher, actually, English academic publisher. One of the biggest and I suppose most innovative pulp publishers. So Australian pulp Australia did have a local sort of pulp publishing industry which grew up in the 1940s, late 1940s, largely as a result of import controls that were placed on, I suppose, American pulp material, which was seen as hugely salacious and threatening to young people's morals. That was in the late 30s. And then in the 1940s, those import controls were expanded to all imports that weren't to do with the war effort. So that was virtually all print material. Was basically prohibited from coming into Australia from about 1939 to all overseas, I should say. Imported print material was prohibited from coming into Australia from about 1939 to about 1959. I mean, in reality, you can never stem the flow of that sort of stuff. But, it certainly created a big opportunity, and there are all these Australian publishers that decided they'd start doing pulp. One of the biggest was Horwitz. And Horwitz was a sort of weird publisher in the sense that it was a pulp publisher, but it was also quite a hybrid publisher. It had a foot in the mainstream publishing area. And what Horwitz did very effectively, which is because I'd had all these books, but it was only when I really studied Horwitz I realised that what they did very effectively was that they would basically monitor overseas publishing trends. And then they would create local analogues, Australian analogues of overseas publishing trends. So, for example, in the 50s, a major overseas popular publishing sensation was naval war novels. Herman Walk and I think Alistair MacLean's first book and all these various novels. And so Horwitz did this huge series of naval war novels. And likewise in the 1950s, what we would now call sort of Nazi exploitation stuff. So that would be your House of Dolls and Scourge of the Swastika, these kind of semi-fictional books which were basically plugging into various stray. You could do a whole show on that. You did it with Sven Hassel, that whole fascination, horror, revulsion, the sex, the violence, all that sort of stuff. So Horwitz produced this series of about several hundred books which were all about the Australian POW experience under the Japanese. And they were incredibly explicit covers. Like they're mainly about Australian servicemen and civilian Australian women, although sometimes they're American, usually nurses, being subjected to every single possible sexual and physical deprivation you can possibly do. Certainly on the covers anyway, the contents are a bit different. But this series of covers, most of the most visceral ones of which were drawn by this guy called Cole Cameron, who was Horwitz's main artist one of Horwitz's main artists in the 60s and 70s. But that, in turn, reflected the fact that POW fiction was really big in the 1950s and 1960s. And actually, Australia was a real pioneer of POW fiction in the 1950s. And that was mainly material was usually non-fiction accounts by Australian servicemen although there were a couple of female accounts of Australian servicemen and their time in Japanese POW camps, which was horrendous. And they gave the British a good serve too, because the British were seen as having royally screwed up the defence of Singapore. And for Australia, see, that was our big trauma of World War II. The vast majority of Australians that were killed in World War II were killed in Japanese POW camps, largely taken prisoner at the outset of the war, Singapore, etc. And so Horwitz did this huge list of incredibly salacious, sexually violent books that were going on well into the 70s, and some of these were published in 3 or 4 different editions. They were hugely popular, written under a couple of house names. One was John Slater, the other was Jim Kent, mainly serviced by one people, although various Horwitz authors would jump in and jump out. But this stuff, you look at this stuff now, and they also had a variant of that, which was a sort of Nazi exploitation variant of that, which was mainly sort of attractive members of the French resistance dealing with, or attractive, or people in concentration camps, because Australia didn't really have much purchase in the European war against Nazi Germany. We were very involved in the war in North Africa, but that wasn't very, very sexy, and didn't birth a great deal of fiction. Whereas the war in the Pacific, huge amount of fiction, including a huge amount of pulp fiction. And actually the interesting thing is you read those mainstream books that were bestsellers in the 50s, the ones that Horwitz then sort of based their own sort of pulp takes on. They're actually as racist and violent and sexually violent as the pulp stuff. That stuff was huge in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned the lurid covers as well, because that was kind of the entry point to drag people in, wasn't it? Whether the contents would match or otherwise. And I think we discussed it a little bit on the Sven Hassel show that we did, that there was something very, very striking about some of those corgi covers in the certainly in the early 80s. The corgi covers from the 70s were like sepia, black and white pictures, actual real pictures of dead German soldiers in some barbed wire with black and red, really striking imagery kind of plastered around it, and a stand first underneath that said "The book no German publisher dead" print. And a lot of these covers, particularly when they get republished over and over again, I think it's a real lost art, the cover of the 60s and 70s, because I know it's certainly the case with Sven Hassel that by the time they were getting republished, probably in the early 90s, and they've not been always in print, but the Leo Kessler books had kind of sold God knows how many copies, and whereas the Sven Hassel books tended to be, lurid and unpleasant, but generally had an anti-Nazi and anti-fascist bent to them. The Leo Kessler books were all about heroic SS men fighting against odds at Monte Cassino, and really kind of really quite wrong-headed. But they also had these covers that matched that. The covers were almost like really nicely painted covers of a comic. So really clean lines, nothing really terrifying or disturbing about them. And sadly, in the 90s, the Sven Hassel books got those covers, which just meant that they just got lost in the mix. But those corgi covers of the 70s and 80s just leapt off the shelves in the face of a 10-year-old child. But it is fascinating that the stuff about the Australian trauma in World War II informing a whole field and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books that were voraciously kind of swallowed up. I now need to actually find some.
Well, you can't. They're actually collector's items now.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is you can never find out who actually read them. It's interesting. I've got a lot of these books, and every now and again you find like a woman's name as the owner. In that you open the front cover and there's a woman who's written their name, but you presume they're mostly men.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it wasn't just men that read pulp, but I think it was men that mainly read these very salacious, violent Nazi exploitation and Japanese POW camp books. The covers are pretty full. I mean, the covers of the Nazi exploitation books very much are part of that tradition of the sort of sweat magazines and the shutter pulps in America, with Nazis menacing, people with blowtorches and things like that. Or the sort of the Orient, the sort of more racist Oriental, the sort of Fu Manchu type characters.
Yeah.
As in the Japanese prison camp guards, sort of ogling nurses and things like that. But some of them are things like, Australian servicemen being staked in the middle of lagoons and there's sharks around them. Or there's even one really famous one, I don't know how famous it is, but it's quite infamous, where this guy sort of been crucified by the Japanese, which links back to actually something that was in a Neville Shute book. What's that Shute book about the POWs in Malaysia? That's a famous scene in his book, the name of which, of course, has completely escaped me now that I've met. A Town Like Alice. That's right. A Town Like Alice is very famous for a supposed scene where the Japanese crucify an Australian POW. But that stuff was everywhere. Right up until, I suppose, the 80s it started. Certainly pulp started to die out in the 80s, and Horwitz stopped publishing in, I think, 92. Some pulp publishing, mainly Westerns, which is the sort of most reviled pulp genre, I think, in the sense that you can still go into rural bookstores in rural Victoria today and find, huge shelves and shelves and shelves of Westerns that turn over all the time, but no one ever talks about them. They never get reviewed. So there was an Australian pulp publisher that was started in 1952, and they went till 2018. They were still pumping out Westerns.
Yeah, I never really got into the pulp Western thing, but strangely enough, when my granddad Pops used to give us hand me down all these books back in the day, for whatever reason, I don't think I ever read one, but he also read loads and loads of them as well, but they always went to my sister. So my older sister Jane, she had piles and piles and piles of J.T. Edson and various other kind of pulp Western novels. Absolutely, tons of them. And yeah, for whatever reason, I never got into those. But then as a kid, I was never really into Westerns, so that's probably what it was.
Well, I'd say, and who read all those Van Hassel books? I mean, they were all. I do remember. I never bought them, but I remember they were always plentiful in the newsagents of my 70s youth.
Yeah.
Someone was obviously buying them. And for that matter, someone was obviously buying those plantation pulps.
But, the weird thing about if I think back to the newsagents in the 70s or the 80s, you had all the goodies, you had all the pop bottles, you had all the magazine and newspaper racks, you had the top shelf with all the grot mags like Razzle and Escort, and then you would have just a spinning stand of paperbacks. And in my memory, this is probably wrong, but in my memory, always 20% of them were just all of Sven Hassel's books. I don't remember seeing them in W.H. Smith's. I don't remember seeing them in a bookshop. It was always newsagents. Always.
And they're still, it's interesting that, I mean, like, and this is the same, I imagine, in the UK, I mean, this stuff gets harder and harder to find. But the thing I never have trouble finding, not that I usually buy, are Sven Hassel books. You find them secondhand all over the place.
Yeah.
And those New English Library plantation pulp books. I still find them everywhere.
Wow, I've never seen.
Try and find a Richard Allen skinhead book though, and you're really going. I mean, I do occasionally find Richard Allen in the wild.
Yeah,
but it's a good day when that happens.
Yeah, I've never ever seen one of his skinhead books or any of those. I've never ever seen one in a second-hand bookshop. I occasionally see them. And I buy them obviously when I see them. Yeah, even the G.F. Newman books like You Nice Bastard and Say You Bastard and all those.
Hard to find still.
Yeah, I end up getting them off the auction site. I've never seen one.
I find that stuff. I do find that stuff. I mean, I think the interesting thing about Australia, because so much English culture was dumped on Australia. That includes, I mean, Australian publishing was essentially controlled by the English until about the sort of 60s when that started to break down, and the English used Australia as a sort of massive dumping ground for remaindered books.
Right, okay.
So Sphere, I mean, I presume this is what it is. So Sphere, New English Library, Corky, that stuff is still everywhere.
Yeah.
In second-hand shops and op shops and all that sort of stuff. Still very easy to find that stuff around.
Sounds like a treasure trove.
Presumably because it was dumped in such incredibly large numbers.
Yeah.
That it sort of finds its way out now.
Yeah. There was a time where, to me, if a book had a New English Library or the Sphere symbol on it, it was an instant mark of quality and something that I wanted to get my hands on. It wasn't just about authors and covers. Literally, the NEL symbol and the Sphere symbol when I was 13 were, give me it. I don't care what it is. I want it. You kind of knew that there was something going to be good under those pages. But you know what? We've been on a couple of tangents there, but we need to get down to talk about Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. So you've told us about how it came around and kind of what the original plan was, and this ended up being a third book, but it does tell a really fantastic story. It's a collection of essays, but actually it tells a consistent and coherent story. And pretty much in parallel, you've got these two, I don't know, in a way, upstart sci-fi publications in the 60s under the stewardship of Moorcock in the UK in New Worlds. And you've got Dangerous Worlds under Harlan Ellison.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dangerous Visions. And, and against this kind of backdrop, you've also got this development of a more overt, I don't know if intrusion is the right word, but a more overt intrusion of politics into science fiction and progressiveness, which comes to the fore, I suppose, in 1968 in that watershed moment with the competing ads in Galaxy magazine, one pro-Vietnam War, one anti-Vietnam War, and for the first time you end up with this kind of political split of the sci-fi establishment. And it's really, really fascinating to read it in more detail, and there's tons and tons to learn from this. Not least of which that some of the female authors writing under male names, but it's in many ways it's like the seed of what happens all the time now on Twitter, in that politics and people's opinions about their art explode frequently and regularly through social media, through articles, through people complaining about woke culture and all these things. So this was kind of like the original watershed moment in science fiction where politics explodes to the fore and something is branded as dangerous and subversive by the establishment.
Well, and it's easy to see that in retrospect. It's easy to carve out a narrative about that in the with a historical overview of it. Whether it was necessarily seen as that at the time, well, that would have been. So obviously around Vietnam, that would have been seen as huge debates and a very active debate. I mean, I think the thing is a lot of it is. I mean, with the decline of the left, a lot of it back in the 50s and the 60s seemed to have more, and the 70s had more purchase on the street. It was a much more of a real sort of events, whereas it sometimes feels, although obviously, this is not necessarily the case, sometimes obviously feels that it's more of an online phenomenon a lot of the time these days, or certainly what gets publicity is an online phenomenon, those culture wars, those sort of debates that you see happening all the time. I mean, the book is an effort with all the books, with Girl Gangs, with Sticking It to the Man, and with Dangerous Vision. Certainly, I mean, I'm my co-editor, so I'm one of the co-editors, and the other co-editor is a friend of mine in Melbourne called Ian McIntyre. And I mean, we certainly think it's important that these books, they cover off on the main people. So yes, you've got to if you're talking about radical or new wave science fiction in the 1960s and 70s, you've got to talk about Moorcock, you've got to talk about Harlan Ellison, you've got to talk about Delaney, you've got to talk about Philip K. Dick, although he's a bit of a different one. Yeah. Judith Merrill, all those people. But it's also sort of what we try and do in all these books is we include authors that are lesser known or have been forgotten. That's kind of important. So, for example, one of the essays I did in the book was a female writer who wrote under the name Louise Lawrence. Her real name was Elizabeth Holden, and she was one of the earliest people, I think, who was writing YA science fiction specifically for teens. Yeah. And probably for teen girls. So that back in the 1970s, when she was writing, very early 70s, when she was writing her first book, Andra, that was a really innovative, new, different thing. And, So that mix is really important. You want to have the main people, the main touchstones, of course, Octavia Butler, all those people, but you want to, Marge Piercy, etc. But you want to include, I certainly want to include series that people have forgotten, authors that maybe just wrote 3 or 4 books, then buggered off, which that kind of stuff. So, for example, one of the great essays in this book, I think, is my co-editor wrote it. It's about this series of books in the 70s called Qi, Q-H-E, exclamation mark, who was like this sort of shaman sort of priest from a sort of lost kingdom who goes and fights sort of bad guys, goes and fights right-wing governments, and tries to bring about world peace. And they were written by this guy called William Bloom, who was this sort of countercultural figure in London in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Things like that. You want to include these. He was a New English Library author. You want to include series like that no one's ever heard of. That stuff that's picking up on things that are going on in the zeitgeist of the culture, in addition to those really big, debates and currents that are going on. Yeah,
they have made it onto my to find list, and along with many, many, many other things. And one of the big problems, I'm going to say problems with a small p, about a publication like this, is it will end up costing me a fucking fortune, because I will be chasing down so many of these things. One of the things that flew off the page at me, and this is also one of the best chapter titles I've ever seen, was the Speculative Fuckbooks chapter.
Oh, look, good luck. That's The Brief Life of Essex House, which was a sort of... Essex House being a sort of publisher that was sort of trying to be a reputable kind of, I suppose, art house publisher hived off a porn business, which was something that happened. Those two weren't sort of set back in that, and you've got to sort of see that history, that censorship is so strong. Yeah. In the 50s and the 40s and the 50s and the early part of the 60s, that when all that suddenly falls apart in the 70s, it's just open slather. Yeah. I'm not saying that some of that stuff is good now or bad. You can look back on it, you can say it's problematic, but you've got to understand why it happens. This huge emphasis on sex and sexuality and sex in science fiction. Like half the book feels like it's about sex in science fiction.
Yeah. Well, I'll get to sextrapolation
Yeah, that's right. And there's there's a whole chapter, I think, on gay science fiction.
Yeah.
That particular chapter you talked about, speculative fuck books, The Brief Life of Essex House, 1968 to 1969. They only went for 2 years, produced a couple of dozen books. Yeah, really hard to find. Like that.
Yeah.
Rebecca Bowman, who wrote that essay, is the librarian in the UK. She works at a university, not in the UK, sorry. She works at a university library in the US, and she's got a big interest in this sort of stuff. And she was able to access those books via the university library to enable her to write this essay, because God knows how you would find them otherwise. Incredibly difficult to find.
Yeah, well, I may never, ever get hold of it, but if I can ever get hold of Season of the Witch by Jean-Marie Stein, it's definitely on my list now. And it was so timely as well, given the conversations that I've had with Hussein recently and only last week about the third part of the final programme, and the meditations on gender and sexuality, just in the book, and just the conversations that Hussein have had. So to actually find out about a 70s book by somebody who was undergoing a transition of gender themselves, writing something so radical and fascinating and, at the time, probably hugely shocking to the average reader, to know that it's out there. And also, quick shout out to the fact that you've got so many brilliant book covers actually illustrated as well. The cover of Season of the Witch is, well, insert chef's kiss gif here. It's absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, I may never get it, but you know what, I'm gonna, if it takes me 20 years, I want to get hold of a copy of that.
It's interesting because Essex House also, Essex House did a lot. I mean, there's an essay I've got in the second book, and this is talking about, this a sense of urgency that I feel. I'm certainly not the only one to try and chronicle as much of this history as I can, because people are dying, and they're getting old, and there was a terrific book which I wrote a whole essay on I think it was the first one. What am I saying? It was in Girl Gangs, and it was in the sort of chapter on hippies. There's this fantastic book by this woman called Jane Gallion, and Jane Gallion was published by Essex House. She was actually editing books for Essex House in LA in the very early 70s, and she wrote this book which is all about the sort of counterculture and how it impacts on a working class couple in LA. And then there's heaps of books set in that time where it's mainly basically middle class people dealing with the counterculture. There's very few about the sort of working class. But I actually had contact with that person, Jean Stein. I think is that correct? I haven't got all the details in front of me.
Yeah.
Jean and I exchanged some emails because Jean was a friend of Jane Gallion's. Jane was a big science fiction writer. So I talked to Jane's daughter about this essay. Jane basically edited pornography for Essex House and edited. She also wrote her own books, and she basically she lived in this really dingy part of LA, and she was part of this big movement. I don't know if you're familiar with the Back to the Land movement. So the Back to the Land movement was a big movement in the US. It was also actually a bit of a movement in the UK, and it was a movement in Australia too, where people went and lived on the land and left the cities. And it was quite a big effect. It was so big in the US in the early 1970s that it was actually captured in stats, in official demographic stats at one stage. It was so big. So it's all these people going out and establishing communes and doing all this. And Jane was one of these people. And she's got this great line in this letter she wrote that I read, where she said, look, it's you think it's easy to edit pornography, but try cooking dinner for 5 hippies on a butane stove, and then going and trying to get yourself into the mood to edit porn afterwards. It just doesn't work. So I talked to Stein, and this happens all the time. I talked to Stein. We swapped emails, and then she just dropped off. She just wouldn't reply to my emails anymore because I was wanting to talk to her more about Jane Gallion.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether I think Stein's still alive, or whether she just thought, look, I don't want to talk to this guy, or I can't be bothered, or I'm too old, or I can't remember anything. That happens constantly in these books, because these books, they are a mixture of textual analysis of the books, treating books. So it's a bit different with the science fiction one, but certainly with the one about youth pulp fiction and the one about radical pulp fiction, it's textual analysis of books that no one really has ever bothered to read half the time. No one's ever analysed them, looking at where the books sit in the culture, but also trying to draw as much as you can about who wrote them, why they were writing them. Often you find, in that second book, Sticking It to the Man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction, you find that a lot of the people who are writing these books which are talking about radical movements in a pulp sense, they're actually members of those movements, and then they're knocking out a novel, and sometimes they go and knock off more novels, or sometimes they just do one or two and you never hear from them again. So trying to look at their lives, trying to look at their books, trying to look at where their books sit in the sort of ecosystem of publishing at the time. I was trying to do that with Jane Gallion. I was hoping Stein would help. Didn't, but that often happens. You get a link, someone gives you an email. Of course, I'm in Australia, so I can't often talk to it's hard to get to actually eyeball these people.
Yeah,
you can't. So and that's happened a few times. You make contact with someone, they look like they're going to be a real trove of information, and they sort of just drop off out of contact for whatever reason, obviously.
Yeah. I'd I'm not involved in these things to the same degree that you are by any stretch of the imagination. I just do this as a hobby. But I remember a year or two ago, I came across like an independent self-published thing called Dude's Dream about the music of Michael Moorcock, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's wonderful. And I contacted the author, and absolutely fair enough, he just said, no, you're all right. It's like, I was like, oh.
It was too couldn't be asked, or too old, or just too...
I don't know. And, fair play to them. It's like, I'm sure people... Amateur podcasters are 10 a penny, and they're rocking around all over the place trying to talk to people about various bits and pieces. But at the time, I was like,
Oh, yeah.
I had a little 30-second sulk.
When they don't share your passion for wanting to know about the... Absolutely. I mean, I find that often happens. They just get to... I mean, I did my... So I was talking before about that PhD I did, which was about Australian pulp publishing, and particularly about the Australian pulp publisher Horwitz.
Yeah.
And I interviewed about 20 people. I sort of went around the place. I had a bit of university funds to do this. And so I managed to talk to about 20 pulp writers and email a whole lot of them. And yeah, some of them were great. I found this one woman who basically was one of the earliest Australian female pulp writers. And she'd written all these sort of pulp novels set in King's Cross, which is kind of your Soho, our Soho.
Yeah.
That was a whole subgenre of pulp, young people coming to King's Cross and being ensnared in a web of vice and degradation and drugs, also having a great time, a lot of sex, playing music, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
She was about 91 when I interviewed her, and God, she was as sharp as a tack. She was amazing. But you'll talk to other people who either just can't be bothered talking to you because it was just part of their life. It was a part of their life from 40 years ago or 50 years ago that they don't really remember that well, or it wasn't that big. It was huge to you, and it wasn't that really that big to them, or you talk to them and that their memory is so shot for various reasons. It's like, well, I'm not going to really get anything here.
Yeah. I've got to also respect the idea that, it's obviously this guy was passionate about what he'd written, but he was passionate about it. He'd written it. He'd written it down.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not everyone can be a freak about it like I am.
No.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I totally respect that. Totally get that. It's, as you say, it's just disappointing.
Yeah. It's kind of that personal level of disappointment, isn't it? It's like, I really want to gas about this with you.
Oh yeah.
Talk to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There was this one editor, just to go on and tell. There was this editor at Horwitz, a guy called Ron Smith. And I sort of trying to find information about Ron Smith. Ron Smith was a big sci-fi, ran all these sci-fi fanzine, won a Hugo for a fanzine in the late 50s. He lived in New York. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurs. He basically bundles his family into a car, and they go out to Idlewild Airport, or JFK Airport now, and they fly to Australia because he just read, what's that Neville Shute book about the cloud coming to, the wars happened and the cloud, the radiation cloud is coming.
On the beach.
And so he's read this book and he thinks Australia's going to be the last place that the nuclear cloud comes. I'm going to go to Australia. So he sets himself up in Australia. He basically edits pulp magazines. He works as an editor for Horwitz. He basically leaves Horwitz, tries to start up his own porn business. It doesn't really work. He sort of gets into alternative therapies. I tracked down his business partner, who I think, this guy's going to be able, because Smith is not exactly an easy name to sort of try and track down. And this guy I tracked down his business partner in the alternative therapies business that he was doing in Melbourne after he'd left Horwitz, thinking this guy can give me some really good information. He just said, that's a past part of my life. I'm not really interested in talking about it now. It's like, but you've got to. You're one of the few people who knew Ron.
Oh, what a shame. It's just like, it feels like a missed opportunity to capture something, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Well, the great thing about this book is that all the people who write the essays capture so much great stuff. And we previously mentioned Sextrapolation, the chapter. And I should point out to anybody listening that it's not all about sex, this book. There are fantastic essays.
There is a lot of sex in it, though, because it's
the
the 60s and the 70s, and sex, drugs, alternative worlds, the new wave. It's sex is a major part because sex is seen as bad. And in golden age science fiction, your rocket ships and going out and conquering alien universes, fighting aliens with ray guns in the 1950s. Sex is not seen as a key part of science fiction. So a key innovation that the new wave is bringing is there. I mean, it's not. It happened before the new wave, and it happened before Moorcock, of course. But they're bringing sex into science fiction. Yeah, women writing about sex in science fiction, men writing about sex. I mean, all that sort of stuff is ooze just basically explodes in science fiction from the late 1960s onward.
Yeah, I mean, there are also chapters on nuclear war and science fiction and ecological science fiction, but there's a lot of rumpy pumpy shot through it all, and the Sextrapolation chapter, there's a couple of things that I really enjoyed in that, and the fact that it was dangerous, and Moorcock and Ellison really were caught in it and pushing it but defending it, and when W.H. Smiths were trying to pressure Moorcock into dropping things or pulling the publication, he was really fighting it tooth and nail all along the way, just the way Harlan Ellison was as well. But there's an absolutely fantastic extract from a fanzine article that Philip K. Dick wrote, where he's effectively kind of lampooning the push to all of this experimental, sexualised, speculative fiction writing in Dangerous Visions, which I laughed out loud at when I read it, because there's this idea of Philip K. Dick that he was this odd, speed-addled loner who possibly got severe mental health problems towards the end and had visions and all these different things. You don't really get a feel for him as someone with a sense of humour, although there is humour in his books. But he lampoons some of the content of Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions, and I'm going to read it out with your permission.
Sure.
And it says, in a hydrogen war-ravaged society, the nubile young women go down to the futuristic zoo and have sexual intercourse with various deformed and non-human life forms in the cages. In this particular account, a woman who has been patched together out of the damaged bodies of several women has intercourse with an alien female there in the cage, and later on the woman, by means of futuristic science, conceives. The infant is born, and she and the female in the cage fight over it to see who gets it. The human woman wins and promptly eats the offspring, hair, teeth, toes and all, and just after she's finished, she discovers that the offspring is gone.
Yep.
That's absolutely fantastic.
That's not so far off in some if you're looking at some of that sort of more out there sort of new wave stuff in the 70s, that's actually not so far off some of it.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
mean, I think the all three books. I actually think, and I should sort of stress this book PM Press, who do these three books, they have a UK operation. The book will be available in the UK. It will take, because of various supply chain issues to do with COVID and all this sort of stuff, it probably will take. It's out in the US probably very early November now. We won't get it in Australia for a month or two after that, and quite conceivably the UK may not get it for a month or two after that. So it'll be out in the UK. Of the three books we've done, this is the best written one. Like, we were really lucky with all the writers, and writing about this kind of fiction can be quite hard because you want people who can write about the books in a way that's not looking down and patronising them, and looking at why these books were such a major part of the culture.
Yeah.
And the people who wrote them were serious people often. Often they were hacks, but often they were serious people. So you want people who can write about these books in a way that is both looking at why they were so important in the culture, but is not necessarily valorising or glamorising, let's just say, some of the more what today we'd call unacceptable aspects that are in these books. Some of the violence, some of the sexual violence, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, that really comes across, because even when Ian writes an essay about Doctor Who target books, there's not a single point where he's kind of looking down on it or casting any aspersions on it. He's talking about them. And again, I found out something new from that as well. I think I've mentioned when I was talking to Joe Banks about his book about Hawkwind, we were talking about Target Doctor Who books, and how they were in many ways an entry point into that kind of need to collect a series of books that sit on a shelf, not just for aesthetic purposes, but because you end up going down a rabbit hole. And we talked about how at the time, when there was no such thing as Doctor Who on VHS or Betamax or anything like that, that was your only way of, and there were no repeats, that was your only way of accessing past Doctor Who. But, I had no idea that, someone like an author like Malcolm Hulke was so political, or a lifelong socialist, and
either
the Communist Party.
Yeah, absolutely. And very deliberately writing progressive, radical themes into these series, and quite conceivably having much more impact than someone doing an academic paper on it, So, and I mean, I think absolutely those Target Doctor Who books, and it was the same out here. Those Target Doctor Who books were gateway stuff. You would read those, and then you'd get into the you'd get into the harder stuff. Totally. I had all those Target Doctor Who books, absolutely, and I wish I still had them.
Me too. Yeah, me too. And I said to Joe, there's no way I am now going back to collecting and rereading them all again, because I had 60 or 70 of them or whatever it was, but at the time. And I took them all in a couple of carrier bags to a shop, and I traded them in for like about a third of the cost of the Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook, or something stupid like that. And but I might make an exception now for the Malcolm Hulke ones. Because Ian's essay has convinced me there's something else to dive into and something else to unpick. Because, funnily enough, I would have read those at the time without ever having seen the original serials. But now I've seen the original serials. I've either watched them on BritBox or I've watched them on DVD or whatever. So, there's a little bit of detail there about how Malcolm Hulke introduced more and developed more of those elements in the novelisations. So, I'm going to be diving in, I think, to some Malcolm Hulke. And it also... It kind of reminds me as well that, again, we mentioned on a previous show that Moorcock had a downer on Pertwee as Doctor Who because he thought it was going to start.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
He said he's not, and he actually used something like the words "not my doctor," which is one of those.
That'd be a hashtag these days.
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
not my doctor.
Hashtag not my doctor.
I think it probably has been.
Because he compared him to Troughton, and he didn't like the fact that I think it was a really superficial surface level viewing of Jon Pertwee as the Doctor is now embedded in the military, and I don't think he went any further than that in his analysis. I think he must have just stopped watching it. But actually, just reading that chapter and reading that essay just really actually reinforces, when you think back, just how progressive and forward thinking the Jon Pertwee Doctor Who stories were, or certainly some of them. From ecological perspectives and challenging authority and trying to make sure that, I mean, obviously he never did it entirely successfully, but trying to steer the Brigadier and co round to a more
he often did. I mean, I remember in the Green Doctor Who in the Green Death, the Brigadier comes on board with the fact that corporation that's polluting that part of England, which is spawning the Green Death, they're bad. We've got to deal with these guys.
Yeah.
It always happened.
That's a real arc for the Brigadier as well, because
that's right.
Two seasons before in the Silurians, the Brigadier is pretty awful.
Is he?
Oh yeah.
You're really stretching my memory of it now. I mean, I did. Yeah. I watched.
Yeah.
Jon Pertwee was my doctor.
Yeah.
And he was what started me off. He was the first one I went, and then obviously we went into Tom Baker, and then I sort of lost kind of interest in it. Yeah. And then when I had a child, a daughter, and I was desperately trying to wean her off cartoons. We started rewatching, I think, the first 2 or 3 series of the New Doctor, and then she lost interest in it, and then I lost sort of. So I've come in and come out of it.
Yeah. So once again, this book is going to end up costing me money because I'm going to end up buying.
Well, that's the same. And people say that all the time. Look, be happy because largely the books in Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, Radical Science Fiction, 1950 to 1985, a lot of them are still available.
Yeah.
The second book we did, Sticking It to the Man, Pulp and Popular Fiction and Revolution and Counterculture and Revolution and Pulp and Popular Fiction. Those books were really hard to find. That's going to set you back some serious cash to get the books in that one. And then going back to the first book we did, Girl Gangs, Biker Boys and Real Cool Cats, which was about the youth subculture. A lot of that stuff is still quite available, although it's getting hard. It's all getting harder to find now. It's all getting harder. And if you're reliant on people on the internet who just sell pulp for the most amazing, ridiculous prices, then you're going to be out some money. And I don't know whether you're interested, Andy, in collecting them as sort of artifacts of a certain time, or whether you want to read them or both.
Yeah, it's entirely both for me.
Yeah,
I love books as things as well as
likewise,
things to read.
but I do, and as much as that, I've got a lot of criticisms of them too. But really old books, Kindle is great. Kindle is your friend for out of print stuff that you just cannot get. I mean, I'm in Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, postage from the US is almost prohibitive now. UK, it's still not so bad, but trying to source any old books from the US, God, forget it, because it's just going to cost too much. Often they're on Kindle. If I want to read them, I'll buy them on Kindle.
Yeah.
I won't buy physical books from Amazon, but I will read their Kindles, because obviously it's often the only way I can get to read old books. And in terms of researching some of these books, some of the Dangerous Visions and Girl Gangs, etc., it was essential in trying to find the books to read them, to write about them. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have been able to do it.
Well, I think, to be honest, what we need to do is start a petition. So instead of collaborating on nuclear submarines, we just put something in place where we can maybe get some of those books back that we dumped on you in the 60s. Let's get them coming back the opposite way.
Of that, we're keeping them. As I say. I can still, for all your British listeners, for all your UK listeners, I want you to know, I can still find Richard Allen books in the wild occasionally, incredibly cheap, because no one knows what they are.
You see, that's really tough to take over here.
I know, it's true, and it's and pans and all that, and it's still buckets of pans. But yes, we've been in lockdown for the last couple of months again because of COVID. Let's not go there. But just previous to that, I had travelled to a rural second-hand bookshop I knew, and I found a cheap, good condition copy of Richard Allen's Skinhead for $3.
See, you're not endearing yourself to me anymore by telling me these things.
It's got to have been something good about being an outpost of British publishing for nearly 100 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so when is this book out? Just before we talk about when this book's actually available, because we have as many listeners in the USA as we do in the UK.
Yeah.
Looking back on this and the terminology around the new wave of SF, it's easy to kind of underestimate the impact, because the terms new wave start to lose a little bit of impact because we've had the new wave of British heavy metal that brought rough, raw new dimensions to rock music in the 80s. We had new wave pop that brought flock of seagull haircuts and massive jackets. But actually what this book really puts front and centre is how truly revolutionary and progressive the new wave of science fiction was. And that's why... No, that's just one of the many reasons why this book is just such a great read. But when is it available?
Oh, just before I get into that, I suppose the other thing you're right about the new wave. It's almost become a sort of slightly cliche term now, hasn't it? Because it's been used so much, and I believe Moorcock is not a fan of the term the new wave. That's my understanding. But we also try and look back at earlier. So we're looking at the new wave, but we're also looking at people who are writing in the 50s.
Yeah. And
doing radical stuff in the 50s. Judith Morell is one. I think we've got a really good essay about the guy who did the Triffids.
John Wyndham.
We've got an essay on sort of the feminist politics of John Wyndham, which is a really good sort of essay.
Yeah.
Second wave feminist politics. So it's not just about looking. It's about looking at the new wave. That it's key, but also what came before in the 50s and what's then following in the 1970s, when the sort of that energy of the new wave and of the counterculture generally is starting to, I suppose, there's pushback against that politically on the streets, and there's also a bit of a sense of exhaustion to some degree creeping into that new wave sort of scene in terms of science fiction, and also people are writing about different themes. It keeps changing. The book should be out in the US. It's going to be October, but due to supply chain issues with COVID and things like that and delays at the printers, probably the date is now November. I think it will be out in the UK probably a month or two after that, and it will probably be out in Australia a month or two after that too. So probably realistically late 2021, early 2022 for the UK and Australia, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, let us know close to the time when you've got more solid information, and we'll do our best to plug it. And the first two volumes in this PM Press series, they're still commonly available.
They are. So I've certainly got a box of a couple of them. There's a couple of boxes of them. So hit me up, people in Australia.
Yeah.
But no, the both Girl Gangs and Sticking It to the Man are still available, and PM is still selling them. And yeah,
that's going to be another hole in my wallet.
Well, yes, they will. They will really put holes in your wallet, I suspect. Yes.
Yeah. So now we've talked about Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. You are up to other things as well, and actually, you've written fiction.
I've written crime fiction. I've written film criticism. I've just written an academic book about Australian pulp publishing. I've done quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about your novels.
Oh, the novels are... Look, I've written 2 novels, actually, and I'm just about to hopefully finish a third. So I've written... my very first novel was a crime story set in Cambodia in the 1990s. I was working there as a journalist at the time. And I've just done... And the sort of second novel I did was a different thing. It was kind of an Australian version of I don't know if you're familiar with an American author called Richard Stark. Richard Stark basically wrote a character called Parker, who was a criminal.
Oh, yeah. I'm aware of Parker. Mainly Parker, because, for a terrible reason, because Phil is a massive Jason Statham fan, and Statham did a Parker movie. He did
do a Parker film.
It's shit, but I'm aware of Parker because of that.
Yeah, and I mean, and there were about a good half dozen films based on the Parker books.
Yeah,
the Richard Stark books. And so my second novel and my third novel, hopefully, which are both published in the US, or the first one is published in the US. I hope the second one will be published by the same publisher, a group called Down and Out Books. We'll be publishing that book. That's called Orphan Road. So I'm putting that together now, and lots of more projects than I have time to do.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, I very quickly want to talk about Constellation's Rollerball book that you did, because I'm a massive, massive Rollerball fan. I can't get enough of it, and I recorded it off TV on VHS, and it's one of those tapes that I wore out at the time. There are probably 3 films where I wore the tape out on VHS from repeated watchings, and they're Kelly's Heroes, Cross of Iron, and Rollerball.
All great films.
Yeah. So when I saw that, I think I'd looked at your Pulp Curry website a few months ago, and I ended up getting Constellations, and I can't remember anybody else before, well, or since, it's not that long ago, is it? But I can't remember anybody else writing really anything in any detail whatsoever about Rollerball. So actually seeing that was like was manna from heaven to me. So what made you end up writing in such depth about Rollerball?
I've written quite a lot about film for various publications, paid and otherwise. My honest answer actually is I wanted to see. And there's not a lot of outlets to write long form film books.
Yeah.
So there was a mob called Auteur who have got 2 imprints. One is a horror imprint, and the other at the time was a new science fiction imprint. The horror imprint is called Devil's Advocates, and the science fiction imprint is called Constellations. The science fiction imprint is the newer one. Actually, it's all run by Liverpool University Press now. They run all of that. To be honest, I wanted to see whether I could write 40,000 words about a film. It was an intellectual challenge to see whether I could do that. And I always loved Rollerball. I'd written a little bit about it, and I just thought, look, this would be a really cool thing to write a book about Rollerball. And it's actually not just a book about Rollerball. It's actually a book about what I call murder sport films, which are films where people are killed for public consumption. That's the key thing. There's heaps of films where people play games and murder each other, kill each other for various rewards, but it's only a murder game film in my definition if it's actually a public consumption, a public sport, something that is beamed to the masses, usually with the aim, as in Rollerball, of pacifying them. So that their violent urges, their rebellious urges are channeled into an online sort of a sport, quote unquote, like Rollerball, which is basically what that book is about. I want to see if I could write 40,000 words about it. I ended up writing about Rollerball, but also about that about murder game films generally, but also about that point, because why Rollerball hasn't received a great deal of critical recognition is because it has this really weird position so it's basically seen as, I suppose, a sort of exploitation film in some respects for those incredible game sequences, which are, I've got to say. And my top tip, people, if you do want to write a monograph of 40,000 words about a film, make sure you like the film, because you're going to have to watch the film at least about a dozen times, as I did. the game sequences never get old. They are astounding.
They're superb. Yeah.
Well,
they're absolutely superb.
all pre-CGI.
Yeah.
With Norman Jewison, the director of Rollerball, basically having to recruit people who played who were motorbike riders, who played roller derby, takes them all to Munich and literally rehearses them on this cycling rink that is built for the Munich Olympics, rents it for a month and just rehearses these guys playing rollerball. Has to invent this whole game. And actually, I interviewed Norman Jewison, the director of Rollerball, for the book, and he's very clear, and this also came out very clearly from my own research, that he got so into the whole thing about what is rollerball and having to have a realistic game that a lot of the rest of the film kind of suffers, and it's all focused on those three incredibly visceral game sequences.
Yeah.
But the film is very much so. There's a chap called Harrison. I can't remember his first name. Harrison writes it. Rollerball starts off as a short story in Esquire.
Is it William Harrison? I think. Yeah.
It was Harrison. I'm pretty sure it was.
Is it William Harrison? I can't remember.
William Harrison. Harrison writes this very sort of about 30-page story. Jewison is one of the most powerful directors in the world at this time. He's on a career height. He's just come off Jesus Christ Superstar. He's done In the Heat of the Night, all these other incredible films. And science fiction is actually becoming science fiction, which up until the early 70s had been a really disreputable genre to make films in. And I mean, it's really only 2001: A Space. So it's 1968 when you have 2001: A Space Odyssey, Planet of the Apes, and to a sort of lesser degree, Barbarella, that people start going, oh, science fiction, right? So it's actually that we can actually make money from science. So studio heads are going, we can make money from science fiction. Also, the technological advances are such that you could actually start to do halfway decent special effects. And Jewison is looking around. There's this story called Rollerball, literally goes into a meeting with Universal Studios, pitches this kind of half-formed idea on the basis of this story he's read in Esquire magazine. And yeah, they give him squillions of dollars to make this incredibly depressing dystopian film about this future that's run by half a dozen by corporations.
Yeah.
And everything is sort of channeled into this incredibly violent game called Rollerball.
Yeah.
The game sequences were what sold the film. It was, I mean, you would have remembered the publicity for the film back in the day. Probably it was all that spiked hand.
Oh, the poster was fucking brilliant.
The incredibly exaggerated spikes and the ball. Everyone, I mean, there was people on the back of that, kids would play roll. I remember at school we played rollerball. People approached Jewison to buy the rights so they could start up a rollerball league.
Yeah.
There were all these debates. There's a clip on YouTube, I think, of this British show where they're discussing, violence in culture and is rollerball contributing to that, or is it a symptom of that? So the book is about that period in the 70s, and Jewison was very anti-violence, and he made the film as a critique of capitalism and as a critique of the violence that he saw in sport in the 1970s. The film comes out, all anyone can focus on is the violence in the sport, and they think it's great, and they all want to play it, and isn't this wonderful? And Jewison's kind of shocked by this. He doesn't really quite know how to deal with it. And it's not a huge hit in America. It's a massive hit in Europe and Japan and all over the place. It's not huge in America, I just think, because they couldn't quite jive with some of the themes in Rollerball. It's big in the UK where, there's soccer violence and stuff like that. It's doesn't quite work in America. So anyway, I just wanted to see if I could write, as an intellectual exercise, could I write 40,000 words on a film?
Yeah.
And it turns out I could.
Yeah. Well, two things there. One is that I really like reading movie monographs.
So do I. Because love a good monograph.
I'm a film nerd. And there's a UK publisher called PS Publishing that's published a really fantastic series of monographs on really quite obscure movies like Horror Express and Deathline. Yeah. There's one on The Brood. But they're really, really fantastic. I'll send you the link to
do.
PS Publishing.
Well, I love reading a good monograph too. And I mean, Auteur/Liverpool University Press, one of the few outfits around that are publishing, 40,000 word monographs on films. Done really big films, like the Constellation series has done Blade Runner and big films like that, but they've also done really small sort of scale films, lesser known sort of films as well. They did the Stepford Wives. They did a terrific monograph on that, and then ditto the Devil's Advocate. Their horror imprint has done a huge swathe of films, really well known and not so well known, really obscure.
Yeah. I'll send you the links afterwards.
Yeah, do.
And actually, I'll put the link in the show notes as well. And just the other observation on that is, it's funny when you talk about Rollerball, they put so much effort into the actual sports scenes. And of course, as a kid, what dragged me into it was the sports scenes, because they were just so incredibly brutal and so well realised. But over the years, and actually, I've got the Blu-ray released by Arrow a couple of years ago, and I've watched it probably half a dozen times since anyway. But I think it's one of those actual happy accidents that they didn't spend quite as much time perhaps on the character stuff in between. And there's a sense where everything feels quite muted and slow. But it's this society where the wealthy all take pills to chill themselves out, or they take pills and then run out into a field to set trees on fire with some kind of energy weapon. I think it really works. Because it gives this weird idea that, like, the upper echelons of society are all effectively on soma. And then it contrasts so brilliantly with the violence and the energy of the sports scenes. I think Jewison might have felt that way about the film, and perhaps he didn't put as much effort in, but I think actually the result is that you get that fantastic contrast. And the brilliant bit with John Gielgud, who just pops up in it as that bumbling old scientist who was like the last caretaker of human knowledge in terms of that computer. I think every single film of that
is that Zero. The
perfect. Yeah.
Oh, look, I think that I agree with you. I mean, I think also Jewison makes Rollerball, and then he's on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And I think there's. So I went to Arkansas. So William Harrison worked as a lecturer at the University of Arkansas as an English professor or something like that, and his archive is there. And so I spent some time there, and I got a lot of really good material. And this is a big deal for Harrison. He's, Jewison asked him to come on set, and he's written a script, and he's spending time, and he's at Pinewood Studios, and he's basically having lunch in the canteen with John Borman and all that. He loves this.
Yeah.
And it's very clear that he wants this to go other places. And then Jewison's moved on. Thanks a lot, William. That's great. Now I'm moving on to my next film now. That's terrific. William Harrison, I think, does one or two more scripts, and then nothing really ever happens. But I think it does come into its own as a sort of depiction of a dystopia that is really, really familiar now. As you say, it's a dystopia where actually the problem is memory and the eradication of memory and the ability to actually remember facts, truth, the ability to remember what's going on in history. There's a really good scene in Rollerball. So the Rollerball is all about, for people who don't know it, is about this major league rollerball, this incredibly violent sport run by corporations, and it's basically a distraction from the oppression of from the dominance of these corporations. And there's this really famous player, Jonathan E. He becomes so famous in the sport that the corporations want him out, because he's actually mitigating, he's actually confounding what the sport was set up to show, which is that there's futility in human effort, in individual effort. And here's an individual who's become more than the game. And so they start changing all the rules, and the games get progressively more and more violent because they're trying to drive him out into retirement. And what starts off as a sort of very gentle way to sort of prod him into retirement gets more and more violent. But it's, there's a scene with Moses Gunn, this African-American actor who's sort of James Caan, aka Jonathan E's coach, where Moses Gunn is talking about history, and he's going, whatever happened to that town? Whatever happened in Baltimore? Is Baltimore the food city? I can't remember. What's happening here? The fog. It's a very real thing today, so it's all about history and facts. It's a dystopia that is very sort of Huxleyan, in this, and as you say, they take sort of mood enhancing drugs which make them happy but fog their memory even more. All of the world's knowledge is put into this giant computer called Zero, I think it is. Is it Zero? And yes, it's housed in this building in Zurich. And Jonathan E. is trying to get information about who started Rollerball. Where did all this happen? How do I find out about my life and what this sport I play? And he has to basically go to this computer in Zurich and as you say, there's that wonderful scene with John Gielgud where he said, "Oh, Zero, he's been very naughty today. He's misplaced the 14th century. The entire 14th century is gone. I mean, mainly wars and a few corrupt popes, but still incredibly annoying.
Yeah.
And that's very now.
Yeah.
In terms of Google and all that sort of stuff and the ability and information.
It's an absolutely brilliant film. I think it would be remiss of us if we didn't pass 20 seconds comment on the John McTiernan remake.
Yes, well, we can. I think 20 seconds is about all I would probably give it. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, how to take the key concepts of a film and turn it into an absolute piece of shit.
Yep, that pretty much sums it up. And
and McTiernan made some great films.
Yeah. I think that's all the 20 seconds it deserves.
Frankly. Yeah, Rollerball is not one of them. No. I have to say, yes. No. But I mean, I think it's a really interesting film, and in some respects, I lucked onto Rollerball because Constellations, that was Auteur's science fiction series, was just starting up, and they were looking for ideas. Everyone was wanting to write horror monographs for Devil's Advocates, their horror one. And John was sort of saying to me, John, the guy who runs it in England, said, I am after a sci-fi ones. And I went, what about Rollerball? That sounds good. Write me a proposal. So, it's a real privilege to write that at that length about a film. I really liked it. I mean, I probably shouldn't have done it at the same time I was trying to write my PhD dissertation, but hey, you learn these things.
Yeah. So you've also got your website, Pulp Curry. Yep. And that is pulpcurry.com.
www.pulpcurry, PULP curry, as in the hot dish you eat.com.
Yep. And I just need to flag that anybody who enjoyed the James Herbert The Rats episode, there's actually an interview with James Herbert that you've posted on there very recently.
I have, courtesy of a British horror author and researcher called Johnny Maines, who did an interview with Herbert and had no online home for it. Johnny also did a whole lot of interviews with a whole lot of other NEL people, but I think a computer crashed and he lost all that stuff. Oh. But I will say now, British pop culture and pulp scholars, why no one has written a decent history of NEL is I'm completely flabbergasted by. And no one has. No one has written a decent history of that publisher. Incredibly influential, important publisher. I mean, there's bits of NEL and bits of NEL authors all over the web, but no one has really pulled that together and done a history of how it worked, how it got its ideas from, and what its place was in British popular publishing in the early 1970s. I find it quite gobsmacking. What are you guys doing?
Another thing crying out to be done. Maybe some point in the future, if we can think of an angle, we can get our heads together, have a beer and talk about NEL.
Well, I would love to do that. I mean, look, a really fascinating publisher.
Yeah, it would totally fit with, into our swim lane, because I would say probably a quarter of the books Pops gave me back in the day were NEL books, NEL paper books. I've still got a lot of them as well. In fact, as it happens, I mean, I can't believe it's actually over 12 months since we did the Rats episode for Halloween. Sorry, 11 months since we did the Rats episode for Halloween last year. But we're doing another NEL classic for Halloween this year after doing a poll with the patrons. We're doing a Night of the Crabs by Guy and Smith.
So, you can still find those books in British people. You can still find those books in Australia reasonably cheap too.
Well, I tell you what, Guy and Smith books are getting like rocking horse shit over here.
Yeah. No, I'm exaggerating slightly, but I still do find Guy and Smith books every now and again.
Yeah. Out of all that kind of field, Guy and Smith, James Herbert, ten a penny, you can get them all over the place. But yeah, Guy and Smith is actually, you're paying quite good prices for Guy and Smith books these days. I needed a second copy of Night of the Crabs for Phil to read for when we do it for the Halloween episode. I paid about 15 quid for a copy of Night of the Crabs. You've
had trouble getting those, have you?
Yeah, and there's quite a few others as well, which are a lot more obscure. In fact, it was pointed out to me by Graham, aka Open Sussex, who's one of the friends of the show, that he'd come across a Guy and Smith Prisoner of War exploitation book.
Totally NEL's bollywhack.
Yeah.
In the 1970s. Look, I think, we covered NEL quite a lot in the first book. So that was Girl Gangs, Biker Boys and Real Cool Cats, Pulp Fiction and Youth Culture. We had a whole chapter which was essentially NEL biker books, about 3 or 4 articles on NEL biker books. And we had a chapter which was on sort of British sort of youth subculture books of the 1970s. They deserved a whole chapter on their own. And we reproduced some stuff by a guy called Stuart Home. I don't know if you know Stuart Home's a sort of English critic, and he'd written quite a bit of stuff on his website. So we lifted with his permission, and we also did some new stuff. Those books were so incredibly influential, and I love the fact that this book, Skinhead by Richard Allen, and everyone thinks, wow, this guy's written so accurately about skinhead culture that this guy must be a skinhead. And there's a documentary on YouTube, Skinhead Farewell. I can't remember what it's called. You'll find it on YouTube. It's about a 30-minute documentary about New English Library books, mainly about the Richard Allen skinhead books. And there's one scene where they're talking to all these skinheads, and these skinheads are going, and I won't try and do the English accent, but they're all going, yeah, this guy has to be, or the various derivations of an English UK accent.
Yeah.
This guy has to be a skinhead. He's nailed us so consistently. And I was thinking, you mean the violence, the nationalism, the racism, all that sort of stuff. But no, he's done that. And it turns out these books are written by this aging alcoholic Canadian hack writer called Richard Allen, whose sole research in terms of writing the skinhead books is probably reading a lot of tabloid newspapers and all the reports. But he actually goes down to London, walks into a pub, finds some skinheads, chats to them for a couple of hours, buys them some lagers, pisses off back north, writes Skinhead, and it's so influential. You know, teachers are giving it to their students because they're so happy to see kids reading a book.
Yeah.
You know, even if it's Skinhead. I just think that is one of the greatest stories in pulp publishing I've ever heard.
Yeah. Weirdly,
phenomenal.
Those books completely passed me by. I never even heard of them till a couple of years ago.
Yeah, me too. I mean, the other ones that I think are really interesting from a point of view of this show, but also generally. So, look, one really big strand of pulp fiction in the 60s, it sort of becomes round about Easy Rider. And then it goes on, is biker books. And biker books are a big thing in the UK, in the US. They're actually quite big in Australia. There's this whole, Horwitz do this whole series of biker exploitation books. And NEL is the primary producer of biker books in the UK. I'm not massively knowledgeable about the US ones. The Australian ones are by and large shit. The UK ones, though, are really good. The UK ones are biker books. A lot of them set in this crumbling England where there's all these weird biker gangs and youth subcultures, and the bikers are engaged in this war against a despotic government, and they're really, really very good, I think. There's things in them that won't pass muster with contemporary sensibilities, but the new English Library biker books I've read have been top notch in terms of mixing all those sort of mixing biker stuff with what's going on in the culture and some sort of really weird aspects of where new wave science fiction in the UK is going in the 1970s, which is, you know, heavily dystopian, oppressive governments, you know, dysfunctional society, things collapsing. I won't say there's any parallel to today, but you know, that's definitely, those books are worth getting.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Once again, I'm just tallying up all of these things and adding them to my to-buy list, and my wallet is going to explode with all this.
Explode!
Yeah. So on that exploding wallet bombshell, I'm going to say this has been really fantastic. Reading this book really opened my eyes to a lot of things that I thought I knew quite a bit about, and a lot of things that I knew fuck all about. So it's a brilliant read. Strongly encourage anybody who's into this brand of fiction to be all over it, but also to realise that they will end up going down rabbit holes and chasing all sorts of books that they'll definitely want to read, especially voracious readers who are fans of this podcast. So thanks, Andrew, for coming on. It's been absolutely brilliant. I hope we can get together again at some point in the future and maybe talk about something else like NEL or anything else that occurs to us.
I would love to, Andy. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Super. Thanks very much.
No worries.
Massive thanks to Andrew and Nette for joining me in virtual Derry and Toms. And you may notice this was recorded before the Halloween show. Our rod got a bit messed up due to technical issues, but no harm, no foul. You can find Andrew's website at pulpcurry.com, and New Worlds and Dangerous Visions is available to order now, as are the previous volumes. Also, Andrew's Rollerball edition of the Constellations chapbook series is also available via Auteur Publishing and highly recommended to fans of the movie. Due to the shipping issues Andrew mentioned, my copy of New Worlds and Dangerous Visions is yet to arrive, so I can't make a random draw for a copy of that on this show, sadly. However, whilst on my jollies a while back, I did pick up a second copy of the 1970 Hutchinson's of London edition of The Chinese Agent, featuring the wacky and eyebrow-raising spy caperings of one Jerry Carnell. It's a nicely weathered hardcover edition, formerly of the West Derby branch of Liverpool City Libraries, so it has a nice bit of history to it. So, the dice have spoken, and the winner is Gareth Wilson. Gareth, I'll get it in the post to you this week. But now, time to thank our patrons. And I'm going to start with our TL's champions, Tim Cardos, Sebastian Weetabix, and Anthony Piconti. Thanks as ever, fellas. And also, navigating the grey fees, our chaos engineers. They are Andrew Van Ness, Andrew Cicluna, Anthony Porter, Ben Fletcher, Dave Washman, Fred Quiche, Jim Kirkland, John Lays, John Timothy Watt, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Nelbert, Simon Perrins, and Tony Milazzo. And to our Jugaderos playing the tables at the Terminal Cafe, Alexander Harris, Craig Ledley, Ian Stead, Loz, Taylor, Asako So, Miles Reed-Labato, Graham Holden, Tom Murphy, and, new to the decks, Dave Dalrymple of the Frozen North. Welcome aboard, Dave. Brute of Lashmar is knitting you a scarf and mittens and has saved you a spot by the brazier, although you might have to listen to his thoughts on democratic accountability in the 39 worlds of Oog below decks. And of course, to our mighty patron demons, they are Andy Clark, Ed Scott, Gareth Wilson, Imria, Paul Hillary, Mort Main, Neil Burton, Norman Beresford, Randall Gatlin, Joe Monty, Will Jameson, and Robert Macmillan. So, that's enough from me. As ever, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. We have our Patreon page too, where there are a couple of bells and whistles. And also, we'll be recording a short follow-up to our Night of the Crabs episode with our own friend of the show, Graham Holden, and Phil. We'll be talking a little bit more about Guy and Smith, and also we've taken a look at Crab's Moon, a subsequent Crabs novel that takes place at exactly the same time chronologically as Night of the Crabs down the coast. Excitement awaits. So meanwhile, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.